Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 543, and today is February 12th, 2024. I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. A lot of news to talk about in today's show. Please share the show. It's hosted at the Libertarian Institute. I repost the show on the blog at antiwar.com, YouTube, Rumble, or Odysee for the video version of the show. And then it's up anywhere you could listen to audio podcasts. And follow me on X. I post a lot of just my thoughts on different things happening, going on with foreign policy. If I see any breaking news, I try to put it out as soon as I could confirm it on my Twitter feed. So that's at Kyle Anzalone _. And of course, I post all the shows and all the articles I write there as well. All right. Let's start with this one today. It's actually from last week, but I just didn't have time to get to it. So, U.S. to increase military aid to Guyana amid tensions with Venezuela. So, the U.S. is planning to increase military aid to Guyana amid tensions with neighboring Venezuela over a disputed region. The AP reports that did not detail how much the U.S. will be providing, but said the U.S. will help Guyana acquire new helicopters, a fleet of military drones, and radar technology for the first time. So that seems like a pretty significant aid package. In 2023, the U.S. provided Guyana with $2.7 million in total aid, including over $400,000 from the Pentagon's Military Education and Training Program, which trains foreign militaries. Guyana is a small country with a population of only around 800,000. According to the Associated Press, the Caribbean nation's military numbers less than 5,000 troops. And this territory that is disputed is about 2/3 of Guyana's territory. And it's, the region that borders not only Venezuela, but also that kind of tri-border area with Brazil as well. And Brazil has worked really hard to try to get some kind of diplomatic dispute here and diplomatic solution to the dispute. And it seemed like things were going in that direction until the U.S. started increasing military aid and the U.K. started increasing military aid to Guyana. And it seems that that has set back the talks a little bit. So we'll see what happens and how this progresses. Next up, this one from Kelly Vlahos, who is one of the editors at Quincy Institute. So she writes, Swedish officials investigating the September 2022 explosion of the Nord Stream pipeline say they are closing down their probe and handing it off to their German counterparts, offering no new insights into who done it. The Swedish public prosecutor said in a statement Wednesday that the investigation has been systematic and thorough, but against the background of the situation we now have, we can state that Swedish jurisdiction does not apply. He added that the German investigation continues due to the security that prevails in the international legal cooperation. I cannot comment further on the cooperation that has taken place. I will also not be able to comment anything further on the conclusions of the Swedish investigations or comment on any suspected persons in the Swedish investigation. The Denmark and Germany have official probes into the sabotage too. According to Market Watch reporting this story this morning, Denmark said officials did not have an official comment, and German officials said their probe is still not finally finished, but we expect to be able to make an announcement within a short time. This certainly comes as a disappointment for those waiting to hear some resolution to the mystery, which began on September 26, 2022, when reports came in of damage and leaks to the Nord Stream 1 and 2 natural gas pipelines that run from Russia to Germany under the Baltic Sea. Investigators have since narrowed down that it was an act of sabotage and likely a state actor, although probably not Russia, which initially was blamed for the act by numerous public figures and the press in the U.S. All right, so U.S. rejects Putin's offer for negotiations on Ukraine. The U.S. has rejected Russian President Vladimir Putin's latest offer for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine, as the Biden administration has consistently discouraged diplomacy in the nearly 2 years since Russia launched its investigation. Putin made the offer during an interview with former Fox News host Tucker Carlson, which was released on Carlson's website and X account last week. We are willing to negotiate, Putin said, referring to the U.S. government. The Russian leader added, "You should tell the current Ukrainian leadership to stop and to come to the negotiating table." In response, a spokesperson for the White House National Security Council told the New York Times that the U.S. has no reason to believe Putin is being genuine. Both we and President Zelensky have said numerous times that we believe this war will end through negotiations. Despite Mr. Putin's words, we have seen no actions to indicate he is interested in ending the war. If he would pull back his forces and stop his careless attack on Russia. And so, this is the unfortunate thing about how the U.S. interprets anything any other country in the world says when, maybe Putin is here trying to throw out a line and see how the Americans are going to respond if they are interested in negotiations. And rather than saying, oh, if the Russians are willing to talk, then we're going to have somebody from the State Department reach out to somebody from the Russian Foreign Ministry, and we're going to see if maybe the situation has changed and if it's worth having personnel sit down for face-to-face talks, and maybe Blinken will call Lavrov or something. That's what you would hope the response is. But the American response is Putin isn't serious about talks unless he withdraws all of his forces from Ukraine, which obviously isn't going to happen, even if this was, the most unjust war in history. And what Putin was doing was equivalent to what Hitler did during World War II. And it was really just about taking Ukrainian territory so he could round up the Ukrainians and kill them, as, the U.S. establishment would like us to believe. Even if that were the case, you can't just say that the other side has to capitulate to your demands and then you'll negotiate with them. That's not how negotiations work. And so this is just, the absurd thinking that has been so, pervasive in the U.S. establishment, but really the Biden administration has been the worst about it. So that, there's a lot in that interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin. I've watched about half of it now. So I know a lot of people are kind of making a big deal out of Putin being able to talk about Russian history for 30 minutes, which I kind of get when you look at Biden and Trump and some other people who could potentially be U.S. president, where you really wonder if they could give a good detailed version of American history that takes 30 minutes, that's, a well thought out, this is how we were founded, this is what's important to us, and this is how we got here today. It is, I think, a little bit of filibustering, but again, compared to maybe the American leadership, this looks impressive. I'm not sure it should really be thought of as that impressive. I would assume that, other leaders of other countries like Germany, France, Spain, Italy, their leaders do have this, their national concept in their head, and they could articulate that in a 30-minute conversation explaining, how France or how Italy went from the 1200s and until today or something like that. These kinds of things are possible. It just only seems impossible because of the mental status of our leadership. So I think there's a lot of important stuff in that interview. I also think some people are maybe overstating the importance of that interview, but it is good anytime you're going to get intention on the fact that Putin comes off not as a Bond villain, Hitlerian type, but rather a fairly rational man who can be dealt with, which I think, it accurately reflects who he is. All right, next up here, Senate takes another step towards passing $95 billion foreign military aid bill. So we talked about this on the show last week, that after So the Congress, particularly in the Senate, Republicans and Democrats spent months negotiating a bill that came out to be $118 billion, started at like 105 billion, and they shoved another 13 billion into there. That was going to fund the war in Ukraine, the war in Israel, the military buildup against China in the Asia Pacific. It was going to reimburse U.S. Central Command for funds used in the war against Yemen, Iraq, and Syria, and also provide funding for munitions for the war in Yemen and border security. And so the border security was about $20 billion of that bill. The other, I guess, was that 4/5 of the bill was all going to be military spending. And it was a supplemental defense bill, but the Senate and everybody, the media, the way they were talking about, they were calling it a border bill. Well, the border compromise that came out was unsatisfactory towards Republicans, particularly in the House of Representatives, and the House Speaker Mike Johnson declared the bill would be dead on arrival. And so the House went one route, which was they decided they were going to introduce a $17 billion bill that only provided funding for Israel, not the border, not Taiwan, not Ukraine, not anything else. The money was just going to go to Israel. Now, interestingly, because usually, especially in the House, it doesn't seem like this happens very often, where they will take a vote that doesn't pass, but they took a vote that didn't pass. Now, this was a procedural vote, and so they were trying to suspend the rules, and rather than going through the normal process of passing a law, they wanted to do like this instant pass. And so that was going to require 2/3 of the House, and they didn't get there. So that failed. And then the Senate went ahead and voted on the $118 billion bill. That failed. And then so Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer said, okay, I'm going to strip out the border stuff and we're going to introduce this $95 billion bill. And somehow this thing is moving through the Senate. And so, you know, whatever politics are going on in Washington, I don't understand it right now. How possibly removing the border stuff could have broken the gridlock, because the gridlock was all over the border stuff in the first place. So I assume this doesn't pass the House. No chances of passing the House. The only thing I could imagine is that the Senate is planning on doing something with immigration, and they're going to have an amendment to this bill that states all the, maybe an amended version, but something similar to the original border agreement back into this bill. And I bet it ends up being over $120 billion. Now, the good news is there's a lot of lunatics in the Senate, but there's one reasonable man, that is Senator Rand Paul. And Paul said he would hold out until hell froze over, and indicated he would delay the vote by speaking about national debt on the Senate floor. Senator Paul said, according to CNN, "I love to talk. That's one of my favorite things to do. Yes, I slept all day yesterday waiting for this. I'm going to take Adderall. Nah, I'm just kidding." According to NBC News, Paul estimates that on Sunday that a final vote will likely be held on Tuesday or Wednesday, after he exhausts all of his ability to delay it. If all 100 senators agree to hold the final vote, it would happen much more quickly. Proponents of the bill believe that the procedural vote is a preview of the final vote, so they expect it ultimately to pass. So while the Senate is kicking around this bill that includes 61 billion in aid for Ukraine, the Ukrainians are out of soldiers. Ukraine facing troop shortage on front lines. This one from the Washington Post. The Post reports the Ukrainian military is facing a critical shortage of infantry, leading to an exhaustion and diminished morale on the front line. Military personnel in the field said this week, a perilous new dynamic for Kiev nearly 2 years into the grinding, bloody war with Russia. In interviews across the front lines in recent days, nearly a half dozen soldiers and commanders told the Washington Post that personnel deficits were their most crucial problem now, as Russia has regained the offensive initiative on the battlefield and is stepping up its attacks. One battalion commander in a mechanized brigade fighting in eastern Ukraine, said his unit currently has fewer than 40 infantry troops. The soldiers deployed in the frontline trenches who hold off Russian assaults. A fully equipped battalion would have more than 200, the commander said. Another commander in an infantry battalion of a different brigade says his unit is similarly depleted. A battalion commander said the companies in his unit on average are staffed at about 35% of what they should be. A second battalion commander from an assault brigade said that is typically for his unit said that it's typical for his units to carry out combat tasks. Asked how many new soldiers he has received, he said not including those who have returned after injuries. He was only sent 5 new people over the past 5 months, and other commanders said new recruits tend to be poorly trained, creating a dilemma about whether to send someone immediately onto the battlefield because reinforcements are so badly needed, even though they are likely to get injured or killed because of their lack of know-how. Shortage of ammunition and weapons are also an issue. A commander whose unit was recently moved to a new part of the front in eastern Ukraine says he receives about 10 shells for 2 howitzers. Zelensky acknowledged that artillery ammunition deliveries have slowed as Europe is struggling to manufacture enough shells to meet Ukraine's needs, and the aid package remains stalled in Washington. The personnel shortages can have a domino effect, Ukrainian troops in the field said. Especially in winter when the weather conditions are hard, infantry should be rotated out after about 3 days because units lack troops, deployments get extended, or personnel intended for the rear get pressed into the frontline duty despite being ill prepared for it. Troops are mentally and physically exhausted because of overwork, sometimes can't defend their posts, allowing Russians with more manpower and ammunition to advance. And so, just, a couple things I'll add there is initially when we talked about this war, we said that it would be a war fought to the last Ukrainian, and that is becoming more and more true as the West drags this war on. The second point is, just because this bill is stalled in Washington doesn't necessarily mean that once this bill gets passed, the U.S. has a bunch of artillery shells just to start sending to Ukraine. Certainly, they may have gotten some that they could send Ukraine, but even before they ran out of funding, they were already sending Ukraine a cluster munitions, a cluster variant of the artillery shell because they didn't have any more conventional shells to send to Ukraine. So this is, more a production problem than just a funding problem. And then another thing to add here, of course, is they're putting Ukrainian troops on the front lines, under equipped, under prepared, and you have to really start to wonder if at any point they're going to just decide it's not worth it to send young Ukrainian men into this meat grinder. They're just getting killed. All right. News on Gaza here, and it's bad. Largest functioning medical facility in Gaza facing a major humanitarian catastrophe. Middle East Eye reports Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, the largest still functioning medical facility in Gaza, is facing a major humanitarian catastrophe, according to a senior Palestinian health ministry official. A spokesperson for the ministry said on Thursday that Israel's complete siege of the hospital and targeted attacks in its vicinity have left thousands inside the complex at immediate risk of death. He said there are 300 medical staff, 450 wounded, and 10,000 displaced people in the Nasser medical complex being killed and starved. The besieged hospital is suffering from an acute shortage of anesthesia and intensive care medication, as well as surgical supplies. Staff and patients are in danger at the Al Amal Hospital in Khan Yunis, according to the Palestinian Red Crescent, which runs the facility. Very close artillery shelling to the Palestinian Red Crescent at Al Amal Hospital, with shrapnel hitting the hospital building amidst continued heavy gunfire, posing a danger to the safety of staff and patients, the organization wrote on X. Palestinian Red Crescent also said that its staff were deliberately targeted by Israeli forces on Wednesday when they carried out a mission to evacuate a number of wounded people in the besieged enclave. Paramedic Mohammed Al-Armari was killed as a result of two and two of his colleagues were wounded. And so Israel is even attacking medical staff in their assault on Khan Yunis. All right, next article here I wrote for antiwar.com on February 9th. Biden administration admits to, quote, missteps in handling Gaza genocide, but will not alter policy. So, a top U.S. official admitted that the White House has made some missteps in how it handled the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. President Biden has shipped 25,000 tons of weapons to Israel, per European Med Human Rights Monitor, and refuses to place any conditions on the aid the U.S. provides to Israel. The unfettered support has allowed Israel to conduct a genocidal military campaign that has killed tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians and pushed hundreds of thousands more into famine. On Thursday, John Feiner, a deputy national security advisor, told Arab American leaders in Michigan that Biden made what he called missteps in handling Gaza and that Israel has no intention of allowing Palestinian statehood. The aide made the remarks during a closed-door meeting, but audio recording was leaked to the New York Times. And so Feiner said, "We are very well aware that we have missteps in the course of responding to the crisis on October 7th. The Times did not report if the aide explained what the Biden administration believed were the missteps. The mistakes Feiner did admit to are rhetorical, such as not including a faster condemnation for Israeli calls for genocide from top officials, and the only one that was mentioned was the statement by Gallant, the defense minister, when he said that all the Palestinians living in Gaza were human animals. He also made reference to Biden not mentioning the tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians. I think at the time it was just around 10,000 Palestinian children that had been killed by the Israeli onslaught in Gaza. When he made his statement on October 7th, he only talked about the Israeli civilians. But, I think really making it out to be a rhetorical issue is really missing the problem that the Arab community has with this policy. It's not that Biden isn't saying he cares about the Palestinian people more, it's that he's helping Israel conduct a genocide in Gaza. After the meeting, participants said they were dissatisfied because Feiner would not agree to any policy changes. The U.S. has provided Israel with nearly daily weapons shipments that have allowed Israel forces to continue fighting. Washington has refused to condemn any Israeli actions, even well-documented war crimes. Biden's full-throated support for the Israeli onslaught in Gaza has harmed Biden's re-election chances. His approval rating is plummeting. About half of his 2020 voters believe Israel is conducting a genocide in Gaza. During campaign rallies, Biden is frequently faced with protesters calling him Genocide Joe. The Michigan meeting was an effort to shore up Biden's Arab American base in a battleground state. Participants said the meeting was tense. The Arab American attendees were disappointed that the White House was still unwilling to commit to call for a ceasefire in Gaza. Feiner also told attendees that Washington was committed to a Palestinian state, but that Tel Aviv would not accept it. Will Israel be willing to do the hard thing that is going to be required of them, which is meaningful steps for the Palestinians on the question of two states? I don't know. The answer to that is yes. I don't have any confidence in this current government of Israel. And so to say that you have no confidence in a government you're shipping tens of thousands of tons of weapons to, it is just an astounding statement to make. All right, next up here, this one from Dave DeCamp, very bad news at antiwar.com today. Netanyahu doubles down on plans to attack Rafah despite growing criticisms. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said on Sunday that he would attack the southern city in the Gaza Strip of Rafah, despite growing criticisms about the plan. It's estimated that 1.5 million Palestinians are packed into Rafah, which had a pre-war population of 275,000. Most of the people sheltering in the city are living on the streets in tents, and many have been displaced multiple times since Israel unleashed its onslaught. On Friday, Netanyahu ordered the Israeli military to draw up an evacuation plan for Rafah, but it's unclear where the Palestinians sheltering there will go. go. A few hours after Netanyahu ordered the planned Israeli airstrikes hit a residential building in Rafah, killing 28. Heavy Israeli airstrikes were also reported in Rafah late Sunday into Monday morning, with Al Jazeera reporting at least 50 have been killed so far. Aid groups were warning that a full-scale assault on Gaza would be a, quote, bloodbath due to the concentration of Palestinians. Egypt, which borders Rafah, is threatening to scrap its 1979 peace treaty with Israel if it attacks the city. Cairo strongly opposes anything that could lead to an influx of Palestinian refugees entering its territory. Responding to the criticism, Netanyahu claimed at ABC News that he had no choice. This is Netanyahu's quote: "Those who say that under no circumstances we should enter Rafah are basically saying lose the war, keep Hamas there." The Israeli leader suggested that the Palestinians in Rafah could go to areas north that have been cleared by the Israeli military, though throughout the past few months, Israel has regularly attacked these safe zones. Also on Sunday, Biden spoke with Netanyahu and said the U.S. would support an attack on Rafah if Israel has plans to evacuate the civilians. The Biden administration has paid lip service to the idea of protecting civilians in Gaza, but continues to provide unconditional military aid to Israel despite the massive civilian death toll. Over 12,000 children now, over 28,000 people overall. Absolutely horrific. And of course, there's nowhere else in Gaza that has really any standing infrastructure left, and so to the idea that these people could just go to other areas of Gaza at this point, that's a death sentence as well. Any attack on Rafah will be a death sentence for a lot of tens of thousands at least Palestinians, if not more, especially when you consider that in the past, Palestinians, when they've attacked places, Gaza City, Khan Yunis, even a lot of the people there are sheltering in buildings and things like that, but in Rafah everybody is just sheltering in tents, and so I have to imagine that the shrapnel death and deaths from just using large bombs in civilians area will be far higher in Rafah than in other areas of Gaza. All right, next up here, House bill would downgrade U.S. South Africa ties over South Africa's genocide suit against Israel. A new bill proposed by two members of the House would require the White House to review and potentially downgrade the U.S. relationship with South Africa. The legislation was proposed in response to South Africa bringing Israel up on genocide charges at the International Court of Justice. South Africa based its case on the indiscriminate killing of Israeli killing in Gaza and multiple calls for genocide by leaders in Tel Aviv. So it was proposed by Representative John James. He's a Democrat, Republican from Michigan, and Representative Jared Moskowitz. He is a Democrat from Florida, and they announced the U.S. South Africa Bilateral Relations Review Act last week. James said when announcing the legislation, South Africa has been building ties to countries and actors that undermine America's national security and threaten our way of life through its support of military and political cooperation with China, Russia, and its support for a U.S.-designated terrorist organization, Hamas. To ensure America's energy security and national security, we must examine our alliances and disentangle from those who remain willing to work with our adversaries. The legislation highlights the charges of genocide brought against Israel at the ICJ. The court sided with South Africa in a preliminary ruling, finding it was plausible that Israeli forces were committing a genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, and the killing was fueled by statements from leaders in Tel Aviv. The representatives also took issue with South Africa labeling Israel an apartheid state. The apartheid designation for the system Tel Aviv uses to oppress Palestinians was backed by several international rights organizations, including Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. The legislators took aim at South African officials for expressing concern about escalating violence and calling for restraint. The American lawmakers did not address the calls for genocide made by the Israeli leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The U.S. has shipped Israel at least 25,000 tons of weapons that have been used to indiscriminately kill people in Gaza. At least 28,000 Palestinians are dead, including 12,000 children. The bill additionally attacks South Africa over its ties to Russia, China, and Iran. The legislation says it is in the national security interests of the United States to deter strategic and security cooperation and information sharing with China and Russia. The South African foreign policy actions have long ceased to reflect the stated stance of non-alignment and now directly favor China, Russia, and Hamas, a no proxy of Iran, and thereby undermining the United States' national security and foreign policy interest. So just some more insanity coming from the U.S. Congress there. All right, that's one here from DateDeCampAntiWar.com. Report Israel backing off hostage talks after rejecting Hamas's latest offer. Oh, my mistake. I actually covered this one on the last episode of the show, and yeah, the Israel is going ahead with the attack on Rafah. They are not engaging in talks here. No more talks. It's a full on slaughter of the Palestinians at this point. All right, next up, Israeli drone strikes killed 2 near key Lebanon port of Sidon. So this one from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com. Israeli strikes against Lebanon continued over the weekend with a Saturday drone attack hitting a car near the southern port of Sidon. The attack killed at least 2 people and wounded 2 others, making it one of the deepest single drone strikes at 37 miles from the Israeli border. The intended target of the drone strike was not totally clear, although early rumors were it was aimed to kill Basal Salah, a top Hamas operative. Israel has not confirmed Salah was the target, but media reports are saying that he survived the attack. Israeli reports did say a Hezbollah member was slain in the strike, though what his position was is not certain. All right, next up here, Arad says it resumed talks with the U.S. on the future of withdrawal. I'm hopeful about this. I don't mean to be too pessimistic when I say I don't think the Iraqis have the leverage they need at this point to get the American troops to withdraw. But you never know how things progress, and if U.S. troops continue to come under attack in Iraq and Syria, and the American people really do start blaming the White House rather than the Iranians for the attacks, then maybe that there will be some pressure to remove U.S. troops. This next one from Brett Wilkins at antiwar.com. Head spinning upset as Imran Khan's PTI party wins most seats in Pakistani elections. So we haven't covered this really Imran Khan's leadership much at all on the show. At times we have talked about him because when it came to Afghanistan and when it came to the early portion of the U.S. and Western economic war on Russia, he was, the prime minister of Pakistan, and Pakistan chose a non-aligned path. And this really upset the U.S. And then Imran Khan was ousted from power, and there were some questions. It seemed suspicious at the time. Some documents, including some released by Imran Khan himself, have purported to show that the U.S. backed his ouster. Now, I'm not sure this was a full-on CIA coup or just, the State Department said, oh, you want to get rid of this guy? We're good with that. It seems like it's a little bit more the latter than the former at this point. But the Pakistan government really went after Imran Khan and his entire party. They put him in jail, I believe, for 14 years. They barred his party. And then his members of his party ran as independent candidates. And so imagine if, after 2020, the Biden administration came in and they decided that not only were they going to put Trump in jail for 10 years, but they were going to prevent the Republican Party from being on the ballot. And then when the midterm elections came around in 2022, Republicans took a plurality of seats in the House and the Senate. That's kind of how this played out here. So very interesting article. Read it by Brett Wilkins. Other than Imran Khan wanting and seeing Pakistan as a neutral country. I'm not sure about much of his leadership. I don't like to praise the guy at all because I don't know about what kind of leader he was in Pakistan. But at least on, his geopolitics seem to really try to favor a non-aligned Pakistan and an independent Pakistan. All right. Last story here today. Houthis hold funeral for 17 killed in recent U.S. and British strikes. This from Day to Camp, February 11th, antiwar.com. The Houthis held a funeral on Saturday for 17 of its members who were killed by recent U.S. and British strikes in Yemen. The Yemeni state news said, in a dignified funeral procession, the bodies of several martyrs of the nation, armed forces, and security forces who were martyred in the American-British aggression strikes were mourned. According to the Turkish news agency, the announcement of the funeral marks the second time the Houthis reported fatalities in the U.S. and British bombings since they started. After the first round was launched on January 12th, the Houthis say that 5 of its members were killed. And so we've seen about every day a strike on average here. I think 30 rounds of strikes in 30 days as we are here on February 12th. And they start on January 12th. So yeah, this is a full-on war the U.S. is in, although it doesn't seem to be making a very big impact on the Houthis' capabilities. All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the show today. And let's see, tomorrow night I'm going to be on with Jacob Winograd. He is, I forget what the name of his show is, but I will definitely tweet out the link to it. We'll be doing a live stream talking about the Tucker interview with Putin, and then anything else that comes up. And of course, I'll give details on any other appearances I'll have this week. Thank you so much, and back with more later in the week.